Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paul Adepoja, and I'm the Community Manager for the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And since the pandemic began, we've been discussing different issues that are directly or loosely related or connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. And today we are looking at how journalists that never had any background experience or previous exposure on health journalism can make this switch. When the pandemic began, we had journalists in different sectors reporting different beats: business, technology, education, agriculture, science, environment, and different several other issues, quickly pivoting to health because it was a topic, it was what was trending, and editors were interested in news on this subject. But not many of them had the preparation or the background or the exposure or the training or education that could really set them on a very successful career in health journalism. And that is something we'd like to do today, and which is to provide some level of guidance on how to start, how to switch to health journalism. And we have someone who personifies this experience, and she's Aisha Abdool Karim, who is with the Bekisisa Center for Health Journalism in South Africa. So we'll be discussing how she made this switch, the experience she has had so far in health journalism, and we hope that at the end of today's webinar, individuals or you journalists that you desire a career in health journalism would have a better understanding on how to get started and how to proceed. And if you are joining us on the Zoom platform, I encourage you to put your questions via the Q&A option that is available here on Zoom. And if you are joining us on a Facebook live stream, I encourage you to also put your questions under the live video that you are watching right now. And I would like to take this moment to introduce Aisha. Aisha, good afternoon. I think it's afternoon in South Africa already. Am I right?
Yes, it is.
Oh, yes. So thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thanks so much for inviting me, and I'm really excited to speak on this topic and also just hear engage with some of the people that are watching and hear everyone's questions.
Yes, please. So let's start with your presentation. You can share your screen and take it away from here, and I'll be back after the presentation with the questions.
Perfect. Okay, so as Paul mentioned, I am a health reporter at the Bekisisa Center for Health Journalism, which is based in Johannesburg in South Africa. And I'm just going to be talking about sort of my experience going into the health beat over the past year, and just sort of like touch on the difficulties and the challenges of covering science when it comes to COVID, and some of I guess a look forward at where coverage can go and how to sort of combat a lot of the pandemic fatigue that not just the public, but I also feel like as journalists, we're facing in terms of getting tired of covering the same topic constantly. So just a bit of background to me. I started at Bekisisa in January of last year. Prior to that, I had primarily been covering politics at another news organization in South Africa called the Daily Maverick. And so I had done a lot of elections coverage in South Africa and just covering more of a political beat, but I was just sort of a general reporter. And so most of my experience was not health related prior to joining. And I basically came in January. At that point, the virus had been identified in China, but we weren't really sure how big of an issue it was going to become. So I decided to do just a short kind of introduction to the coronavirus, because it didn't even have a name at that time. It wasn't even called SARS-CoV-2 as it is now. And that was in February. And since then, I have basically just been continuously covering COVID nonstop. So I have mainly in the health beat only really gotten to explore how to cover science through a COVID lens, and look at issues in terms of the pandemic. And in terms of like what that coverage has entailed, that has also had to evolve with the pandemic. So as I said, I started out with sort of basic explainers on like, how do masks help protect you? Should you be wearing a mask? Like, what is this virus? How does it work? And then slowly switching to more like nuanced coverage. So doing more of like medical misinformation. So, debunking like the hydroxychloroquine. And, for South Africa, we had like ivermectin and interferon were drugs that people were trying to take here for COVID as COVID treatments. And then eventually in about July last year, I switched to covering vaccines and understanding how vaccines work. And then from December onwards, I've been specializing in covering variants. And so essentially what it means is that I've had to switch between different aspects of COVID and learn them and understand them very rapidly, because even like within the health beat and within the COVID beat, there's so much information that like I really can only focus in on like one particular aspect and cover that part in depth in order to fully understand it. And so I think normally when like you're in health, previously health was not really a very big specialty, that a lot of newsrooms didn't have a health desk. It was considered like quite niche. And so people on the health desk would have to cover a wide variety of health issues, whereas my experience has been incredibly focused, because I only cover COVID. And then within that, I pick a specific area that I'm focusing on for that period of time. So in terms of how COVID has been different, I think, is that it is a very new space. And I think even though we're about a year and a half into the pandemic, it is still considered new, because in terms of like the viral, like when you're talking to like scientists and like about viruses, a year is not really enough time to really learn how something is working. And so it's not just that journalists have come into this beat blind, because a lot of journalists did have to switch from doing like general beat reporting to going into health. But while journalists are trying to figure out how to do this job, scientists are also trying to understand how the virus is evolving. They're trying to understand what epidemics look like. They're trying to understand like the trajectory of the pandemic as a whole. And so there's a lot of moving pieces. And I think that is something that's very different, which is normally when you're looking at the health space, you're looking at relatively established information. There are, experts that have been studying this for years. They understand how a virus or whatever it is that their specialty is working. And with the COVID space, something that we've all had to adapt to is a lot of this gray space, when there's a lot of things that it's not just like as journalists, we can't understand it, but there's a lot of things that scientists have to be like, that's like an unknown for us at this time. We can't actually answer that. And so I think there's sort of like a balance that we have to strike between figuring out what it is that we can say and what it is that we can't say. And I think the first step for me was trying to figure out how to understand science, because I needed to understand the baseline in order to figure out what we couldn't understand. And so for me, that was like really getting familiar with scientific journals, like having to like keep up with like publications. But something that became different sort of as it was apparent from the beginning of the pandemic, but I think it became much more important as we progressed and more countries started to experience cases, was that in the current situation, scientific journals are actually not the primary source of information. And so you have to go and look for like alternative sources in order to get the most information that you could at the time. And I think that one of the things that's been highlighted is that there's been a great push for collaboration amongst the scientific community in the past year and a half, where it was really just people trying to keep informed and help each other by getting information out as quickly as possible and sharing whatever discoveries were being made, like whether it's, with trials or even just like sometimes, especially now with the vaccine rollouts, a lot of it is just like observational information, like it's real life data that people are collecting just by like observing what's happening. And so what I've personally seen is that what was previously considered the gold standard for like scientific information, which is peer-reviewed publication, was quickly thrown out the window. So a lot of my reporting it isn't based on peer review, because the peer review process takes time, and a lot of the time the information is being shared much faster through preprints, or people are putting it out in op-eds, they're putting it on blogs, they're just trying to share it in whatever way they can. And so there is a downside with the press releases that we were getting, for instance, like from the vaccine manufacturers. The press releases had like limited information. And so it was only when the peer-reviewed publications came out, or like the FDA review documentation came out, that we were able to get like more understanding of what the vaccine trials found. But in the pandemic setting, it has really been sort of just find whatever information is being put out, figure out if it's trustworthy or not. So trying to like assess the standard of information that's being put out, if you can trust that information, and then trying to utilize those alternative sources in a space where you don't have the luxury of being able to wait for peer review. And then I think on the flip side of that is also the difficulty with COVID is that the science is changing so rapidly. And so I think that one of the biggest steps is like learning to accept that there are limitations on the information that is available. And as much as like I want to say something concrete and be like, this is the impact that the Delta variant is having on vaccine efficacy, that's not possible because the science doesn't move at that speed. And so there are definitely limitations on how much information is available, how much can be shared at a specific time, and how much we can communicate. And one of the more specific issues that I encountered was a lot of the time people trust what they like scientists that you would consider experts in their fields. And science is often seen as something that's very concrete because it comes with data and like studies and trials. And so you just sort of inherently trust scientists not to lead you astray or give you any false kind of information. And I think on that, there are two potential parts. One is, I don't think that scientists are deliberately trying to mislead anyone. There have simply been occasions where like I would interview somebody, they would tell me something that was accurate at that time, and then 2 weeks later, that information becomes out of date. And so it was like learning to adjust to a dynamic space where like the science really is changing on a regular basis. And you have to be, your reporting has to be as on top of the latest information as possible because it is evolving so rapidly. And the second issue, and I don't know how common this, I don't know how common this experience has been to other reporters in other countries, but for instance, in South Africa, there became a lot of political undertones to the pandemic coverage. And so my previous experience in politics was quite useful in that sense. But there was sort of like a blurring of lines between science and politics, because our government created these ministerial advisory committees that were made up of a range of scientists from a range of different backgrounds that they thought would be able to offer insight and apply their knowledge to COVID-19. Because as I said, there's no real expert in COVID, or there wasn't at the time, because it is so new. And so there was this sort of issue where there was the scientific panel that was offering advice, but it was ultimately up to like the Department of Health and politicians to decide how to implement that advice, and what kind of regulations to put in place. And so there was a disconnect at times where scientists would say something and then something else would get implemented, and then people would sort of come for the ministerial committee because they would be like, why would you advise this? It doesn't make any sense. But I think the other challenge is that sometimes people who were sitting on these committees or not sitting on these committees, scientists that I think in some sense wanted a higher profile, might say something that they might not have expertise in. So there was a lot of conflicting information, and it's hard to sort out in a space like COVID when you're not 100% sure what is the truth, because there's so many different studies coming out all the time. And so that was another challenge of trying to figure out like which scientists, which experts can I rely on? And does anyone have another agenda that might cause them to say something that maybe I shouldn't take as complete fact? Like, how do I balance out all of these different spheres of what's happening? And I think also in terms of like my coverage, especially as we enter the variance territory of the pandemic, a lot of what I've had to do is get comfortable with conveying how much we don't know. Because I think a lot of the time, like the public wants very clear answers. And I think as a journalist, like my brain automatically wants to give a clear answer. Like I want to be like, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, this is what we know. And so it's been an adjustment in terms of being like, actually, I think what I need to do in my stories is outline what we don't know and explain why it takes so long to find an answer for that particular question. So it's really about going like one step further into the science. And that's sort of like the building blocks of my reporting, is that I had to start with the basics in order to get to the point where now when I'm talking about variants, I have all of that background knowledge on how the virus works. I have all the background knowledge on how vaccines work. And then I can use all of that to explain why it takes so long to understand so much about the variants. And then I think the next point I just kind of wanted to touch on is that at this point, it is very tiring, not just to read about the pandemic, but also to report on the pandemic. It's sort of weird because there is always something new and important to write about. And I was sort of mentioning this earlier, but when we closed for the year last year in December, it was after the vaccine. I think Pfizer and Moderna had announced their results. And those were like very effective. And in my office, where we're all focused on health all the time, we had kind of been like, I wonder what we'll cover next year. Like maybe we'll have something that's not COVID related on the agenda, because now the vaccines are here and the rollouts are happening, and it seems like we're on a positive trajectory. And then 2 months into my leave, they announced that the beta variant had been identified in South Africa and was driving our second wave of infections. And then, as I'm sure most people in their countries, the Delta variant has now been detected and is driving a lot of waves around the world. So it's sort of feels nonstop at this stage. It does feel like there's always going to be something new coming from COVID, and that it can be a bit difficult to be invested in it, despite the fact that there is always something new to talk about, and there is always a lot of room to like talk about all the different aspects of the pandemic. And so I think one of the things that has helped me is to really ground the story more in how it's affecting people's lives, as opposed to taking it from a purely scientific standpoint. Because just for me personally, I was feeling very disconnected from the science because I had been writing highly technical stories for a year. And it was just getting to the point where I was kind of getting tired of only writing about science. And so I wanted to find a way to relate it back to how people were actually experiencing the pandemic in their lives. And that comes to accepting the fact that the pandemic is not a short-term thing that's going to disappear. It's something that's with us for a long time. And I think even if you're not a dedicated health reporter, COVID now impacts every part of our lives, and it exists across multiple sectors. It has, it has an impact on pretty much anything that's happening. So even if you're looking at education and you're looking at schools, the pandemic is a part of that, because you have to look at like, what is the impact of schools opening, and it comes into like, should we be vaccinating children? Should there be mandatory mask wearing in schools? So that's like, it touches like that part, but it also touches on, for instance, if you're a financial reporter, like in South Africa, there are a lot of financial reporters that have had to take into it, like they've had to become experts on COVID because there are economic repercussions to the pandemic as well. And there are also political inferences. So for instance, in South Africa, there is a lot of attention being paid to corruption in terms of like tenders that were given out for COVID-19 services. There is also, we were supposed to have by-elections a few months ago, and that was when our third wave of infections had started. And so the decision by our electoral commission was that the by-elections had to be postponed because they could not guarantee people's safety if they came to elections. And so there's a lot of things in it. It's like, how do you have a free and fair election during a pandemic? How can people vote safely? Like how do we guarantee people's safety in that kind of environment? And so I think in that sense, it's about taking it beyond just health, but looking at how health is a part of everyone's lives. And I think that's just become a lot more stark and apparent in the past year, is how much this particular beat can touch everything that's happening, and how to look at issues through a health lens while still focusing and telling other stories that are beyond just COVID, but looking at how it is impacting on people's lives in different ways. And so I think just in terms of the future of where to go with COVID, in addition to that, is, as I've mentioned, it is a very fluid epidemic and also pandemic. And for me, primarily at this time, a main issue to focus on is the variants, because there was a lot of assumptions that were made last year when scientists believed that the virus was stable and wasn't going to change. And so a lot of decisions were made on that basis. And then suddenly we started to get these variants, and then they thought that the variants would be sort of minor and that we wouldn't see a lot of them. And as we've seen, that hasn't really been the case. There are now several variants that have popped up and been identified in several different countries. Some of them have things in common. Some of them are very different to previous versions of the virus that have existed. And so there's a lot of things to keep an eye on when it comes to the implications of these variants, not just for, how people are experiencing the disease, but also in terms of what it means for the safety protocols that we have to be taking and what we have to look out for. So for instance, in the United States, the decision to allow vaccinated people to not wear masks had to be overturned because of the Delta variant, because of its, ability to spread so much faster. And I think now, what's on the table is discussions around potential booster vaccines, because of the potential of these variants to escape the immune response that we're having, and because a lot of the vaccines were designed for the original version of the virus. So I think there are a lot of far-reaching consequences to the variants that we can't yet understand, but that we need to be keeping an eye on. And I also think a big part of that challenge is addressing the issue of vaccine inequity. And I think that that's something that is obviously felt more in Africa than it is in other continents, because for us, a real concern is the fact that, a very small percentage of the population throughout the continent and within individual African countries, there's very low vaccine coverage. And it's not necessarily to do with vaccine hesitancy so much as it just that a lot of countries have had difficulty accessing vaccines because a lot of richer countries have bought up and are hoarding doses, although I see some countries are trying to correct that and donate their excess doses. But it's a huge issue when you have countries that are being left behind because manufacturers are not able to meet the demand for vaccines. And so it creates room for new versions of the virus to continue circulating and continue spreading. And I think that's been a message that's been put out throughout this pandemic, which is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And I think that's something that was kind of forgotten when countries were, rolling out vaccines to a large proportion of their populations, because they were like, oh, well, our country is safe now. And it turns out that it's not the case, because if the virus is still circulating anywhere, then it means that people are always going to be in danger of potentially being infected, or of there being a new variant popping up. And I think that is something that is something that we need to be looking at. It's something that we need to be addressing, and it's something that we should be paying attention to, specifically because, with each new variant, the concept of herd immunity also changes. And that figure of how many people need to be immunized keeps moving. It used to be people thought if 60% of your population was vaccinated, then you would be fine. Now with the variants, they think it could be, up until 80, 90%. And so the thing is that the goalposts keep moving. The end of the pandemic is always changing. Where we're looking is always somewhere different, because we're always learning something new, and we have to, again, just be part of that dynamic and fluid space, and learning to move with the discoveries as they're coming along, and fit our coverage into that kind of space. So that's all for my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aisha, for that presentation that really provided a very thorough and direct and specific overview of what your experience has been since you started health journalism early last year. There are quite a number of questions that I have already for you. And I would like to start with, so far your experience with reporting health. What do you think really stands out? What do you think is quite obviously different that you think anybody that is starting health journalism for the first time should be aware of by in comparison with other bits that you've covered before? So what are the key things that I think are entirely and uniquely different about health reporting?
I think that, and I'm not sure how much it differs from other beats, because I think whatever you're reporting on, you have to learn how to understand what's happening in that beat. One of the challenges that I think when it comes to health reporting is that often science can be very intimidating, because you do have to understand a lot of concepts, and you have to be able to filter through a lot of very complicated medical jargon. And so when you're trying to read scientific papers, or sometimes even when you're trying to like talk to a scientist and understand their work, they tend to explain things in a very complicated way. And that has been somewhat of a challenge in terms of talking to people. A lot of the people that I've interviewed over the past year, they're not actually used to being interviewed very often. And so they don't know how to condense and simplify their thoughts. And so I have to like really push and push through and get them to rephrase and break down every single piece of what they're saying in order to understand the nuances of what they're trying to communicate. And that concept applies to reading papers as well, where I have to like pick apart a sentence to understand like basically what every single part of that paper is trying to communicate, especially if it's, you know, something that I'm coming into blind and don't really understand. One of the things that I will say I found very helpful is, so I do have somewhat of a background in science, in that I did study, I took a few science courses one of my majors was biochemistry in university, but then also when I started at Bekasisa, we did an online epidemiology course where we were taught like, you know, these are the basic concepts of epidemiology. And then we also had training in how to read systematic reviews and understanding like how papers are written. And so a lot of that training and understanding the basic principles of science has been super helpful in terms of trying to break down things for my own understanding when I'm trying to, you know, break into a beat that, one, people are not used to having to communicate to the public in simple terms, and also that has very complicated language around it.
So you would recommend that journalists that are trying a new beat for the first time should get some form of training before jumping right into it. Am I correct?
I think ideally, if you can, it would be really useful to try and take like an online course that's available for free in epidemiology. But I know that that's not really a luxury that a lot of journalists have, particularly when you're on very tight deadlines and you just need to put a story out. And so the one thing I would say in that situation, because I will say for February through to about June last year, I didn't have formal training in health. And I really was relying on scientists to explain things to me. And so I think in that sense, if you don't have the time to, you know, take an epidemiology or a science course, sit with experts in the field, talk to scientists, and really try and figure out like what is the best way to explain and understand this concept. Because the more time you spend talking to people, the more that they actually are able to give you insight and break down these kind of concepts. And I always try and get scientists to talk in analogies, because I just find it easier, like as opposed to them coming straight in with talking about their research. I'm like, try and give it to me like if you were talking about like a recipe or something. So
What
that
if
I
they are
get
not?
that.
What if they are unable to really break many things down? So let's say somebody mentions a very complex scientific jargon that he or she could not even break down and simplify to you. So where do you go to for that kind of simplification?
Um, I haven't really had that experience
Wow.
because I feel like my kind of approach when I talk to people is I'm just like, this is your area of expertise. And you have all the knowledge here. Like you're the one who spent years working on this. So you understand it. I just need you to explain it to me. And if you can't explain it simply, then you don't understand it is kind of my way of looking at it. And so what I will say sometimes is if someone is having a hard time breaking down the concept, I will try and rephrase what they've said to me in the way that I understand it. So I'll try and say it in a simpler format. And they'll either be like, yes, it's like that. And then they'll rephrase it in a simple way, or they will correct me and they'll be like, no, you've misunderstood. This is what I'm trying to say. So I think if you can frame your questions in a certain way, you can get people to break it down. Um, I think I've had one occasion where someone really was unable to simplify what they were trying to say to me. Um, and in that case, I just had to rephrase a lot of what they said. Like I had to put a lot of it in like paraphrasing because I was like, every sentence is just so technical that no one's gonna be able to like read this and understand what you're saying to me. Um, so yeah, but I do find that in most cases, when you repeat something back to somebody and they think that you've misunderstood, they'll very quickly learn how to simplify what they're trying to communicate.
Exactly, exactly. Then you made a very strong and valid point regarding the sources of stories for especially around COVID-19 and how COVID, the rapid rate at which new developments are emerging around the pandemic, made it difficult for us to wholly and fully rely on the conventional news sources. For instance, peer review publications that do take a lot of time. And if you now look at it, we have pre-releases and other archives, opinion poll, publications, and also predatory journals. So how were you, what do you think is important? What should a journalist have at the back of the mind when getting a piece of idea of potential story leads from unconventional sources?
Um, yeah, so I think maybe I'll start with the first part, which is identifying predatory journals or uncredible sources. Um, I think that there are a lot of very famous journals that are well known, like for instance, the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, Science, and Nature. Those are some of like the top journals that people think about, and they um, you trust them because they have that recognition that comes with them. But I also think that over the course of this past year, I've had to get familiar with a lot of different journals. And sometimes I'll see that something has been published in a place where I'm like, I don't actually know that journal. Can I trust this paper? Do I trust what they're saying? And so a lot of times I'll do research into the journal itself. I'll see like what the H index is. I'll see if it's, there are rankings for journals in terms of like how trustworthy and like their in the rigor of their process. And so I'll look at that. I also keep an eye out on Retraction Watch because they look at papers that have been retracted post-publication, which is a concern with some of the COVID papers, which is even after they go through the peer review process, some papers have been retracted by journals later. So I want to make sure that I'm not referencing something that's out of date or no longer relevant. And so I do have like a vetting process that I go through if I'm not familiar with the journal personally. And then I think when it comes to preprints, it is slightly more challenging because the preprint servers are just massive, and it's very hard to filter through those papers and figure out where you should be looking. I do tend to, some of the factors that I have is I look at, you know, the scientists that are cited on the papers. I will look up those scientists. I will see, you know, their affiliations, check their credibility as individuals, and then also assessing the studies individually. So I prefer not to use very small, small studies that only have like a handful of people. Obviously, that's not always possible in COVID because sometimes the only information is from like a study that's been done with like 30 people. But I will try and look at like the methodology for the study. I'll try and look at the sample size, and I'll try and assess like how good was this process for the study, like how well was the trial done. And there is like a framework that you can Google that is used to like that's how in reviewers and scientists look at papers. They have like a checklist of certain things that a study should look like to assess it. And then I also think in terms of alternative data sources, a lot of information, particularly, and this is particularly something that I've had to deal with more recently around variants, it's not coming from papers at all. So for instance, like with the Delta variant, a lot of the information is coming from countries. It's, you know, Public Health England was issuing regular technical briefings, and they were one of the first kind of bodies to be putting out information where they're like, this is what we're seeing in, you know, in our observations of how our real life rollout of the vaccines is going. This is what it's looking like for the Delta variant. And so it's about also trying to keep track of different like health ministries in different countries. So it's like not just Public Health England, but also like the Israel's Department of Health was putting out reports with their own data. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the US, also puts out reports. And so it's about really trying to expand what you're looking at, not just from scientific point of view and like from a publication point of view, but also like what are these alternative bodies that are providing this information to us at a much faster rate. And so that's sort of looking at more governmental bodies in that sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there is a question, I think a comment from one of our participants that is well aligned with the next question. The comment is from Ali, and Ali writes, translation of science related to the virus is more difficult for journalists who work for media outlets in their own native languages. They have to do a double job translating science for journalistic story and then translate it for audience in their own native languages, which is actually even a double, it becomes a triple challenge, especially when a journalist is just starting out in health reporting. So how do you localize, what is your advice? I know you mentioned some parts of it in your presentation. I don't know whether I would still like you to expand straight further on this. Localization of scientific findings, of health reporting, of health stories from to local languages in areas where the local language is not in the language of the publication.
Yeah, so I will say this is something that I perhaps feel maybe a bit less qualified to speak on because my reporting is only done in English, which I understand it's a very privileged position, and not everyone is able to report on health in English. I will say South Africa does have, you know, like we have 11 official languages, so there are several people who have had to, you know, translate the science into, you know, several different more local languages that people can understand. I think again, the primary suggestion I would have is and it applies to even when you're writing about it in English, which is to avoid scientific language as much as possible. And I think it's about trying to get concepts through in the simplest way in the simplest way that you can. So without relying on very technical concepts, trying to just get the main point across. One of the things that I found helpful is, and again, even though it's not specifically related to the issue of having to translate, but when I'm trying to figure out, like, for instance, when we're looking at vaccine hesitancy, and I'm trying to figure out, like, how do you package information in a way that can reach, communities, people, living in rural areas, also just like people who are struggling to understand what vaccines are, how they work, that kind of thing. A lot of the time, what I found very useful is actually not relying on scientists in that aspect. So scientists can give you an understanding of a concept, but what I found is actually very useful is to work with communities, speak to people in the communities, speak to community leaders, with, talking to NGOs or, civil society organizations, people that are connected with what those communities are looking for, and how they can understand that information. And that really can help shape the way that you're phrasing things. Because I mean, oftentimes I'm like, when you're looking at a community level, people don't really want to understand how a vaccine works in terms of, like, what it's doing to your immune system. You don't need to explain like antibodies and T cells and all these complicated, they just want to understand like a basic concept of like, the vaccine is working to keep you safe. And so I think in terms of, and this is why I think it applies to the translation issue, which is really trying to figure out like, what is the best way to communicate this without getting too caught up in the science aspect of the concept, because you can explain things in a way that doesn't rely on very complicated language.
Yes, I agree with you, and at least you were actually able to provide even more insight than I would have expected, considering you said yourself that you were not the right person for that question. But yeah, thank you for sharing your understanding about the subject. I also have this question that I would like to bring up, which has to do with how can journalists still find new angles to the same story, to the same pandemic, considering that we've been on this issue for over 1 year now. So how do you think, and so that, and of course, like you rightly said, almost every journalist, we have the same access to the same sets of information. So if you are trying to stand out as a journalist and get unique angles to stories, what is your advice to that kind of journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I kind of mentioned, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because there is a lot of really interesting things that are coming out about COVID-19 all the time. It's just about, for me, it's about finding a way to make it exciting to yourself, because I think it can be tiring when you're only covering one topic constantly. And it really is about trying to find a different way of approaching it. So if you're sort of bored by COVID in and of itself, then I think it's about trying to find another way into this topic and approaching it from sort of like a side door rather than through the front door. And I think that, as we get further and further into the pandemic, there really is no shortage of possible angles that you could take. And that's not just from a science point of view. Like, you don't just have to be covering, the virus and the technicalities of it. You can really be covering anything, and it would be about COVID. So for instance, I'm like, in South Africa, part of our lockdown regulations is that, and I'm not sure how applicable this is to other countries, but we have different levels to our lockdown, and each level comes with its own set of regulations, and those regulations can change. And so one part of our regulations was that we had a ban on alcohol and a ban on tobacco products. And the alcohol ban caused a lot of controversy because people felt quite strongly that they should be able to have access to alcohol, and the alcohol industry was lobbying very hard to have the alcohol ban lifted. And it raises a lot of different issues where you're now not reporting on COVID in the sense of like you're covering COVID, but you're now reporting on alcohol, which is another health related issue. You're looking at how if the ban is working, you're looking at how it impacted, it reduced the pressure on hospitals because it reduced the number of trauma accidents that were happening, and it had far reaching implications. And then there was also the lobbying aspect, which comes into politics because a lot of politicians have ties to the alcohol industry. And so that's what I mean, which is like the more you work with the pandemic, the more you look at issues within your community, within your space, within your country, whatever area that you're focusing on really can give you an endless amount of angles to come at the pandemic from. And that's, as I said, it applies to any possible sector that you could think of. Like it's not just economic, it's not just political, it's not just from an education standpoint. Like it doesn't matter what you are interested in, there is some way to add a COVID angle onto that story.
Yeah, and so this next question from another participant, I think, is asking regarding how do you think the pandemic has affected journalists in terms of news coverage? Yeah, can you take that quick?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, I think that at the beginning of last year, there was a sudden scramble in a lot of media houses. And again, I'll speak more to like my knowledge of South African media outlets, but I think it is applicable more internationally as well. But I think that there was a scramble from a lot of news desks to suddenly cover not just health, but COVID specifically. And I think what that meant was you had a lot of journalists coming onto a beat very quickly, a lot of editors having to figure out like where attention should be. And I think that for the majority of last year, COVID was the primary focus of a lot of news coverage. I don't think you could read the news without having COVID in your face. It was it was like the biggest thing that was happening in the last year. I think it would take a lot to beat that story. And so in terms of news coverage and news priorities, I think it really was at the forefront of everyone's mind and at the forefront of coverage. What I have seen is that for this year, so in the past 6 months, and I think it started towards the end of last year, is the fatigue with COVID set in. And so a lot of, and again, I'm speaking to local media, but I'm assuming I'm hoping it applies to more international publications as well. But a lot of news coverage tended to shift away from COVID-centric stories because they felt that people were no longer interested in reading about COVID. And I think one of the challenges is, I work at a health journalism center. We only cover health journalism, and it's not really a space currently where you can talk about anything that's not COVID if you're a health journalist. And so for us, it was a challenge because we were still writing all of these COVID stories, but we were having trouble, there was less traction for some of them because I think at that point, people just weren't interested. And so in terms of the impact on news coverage, what I think it is there is a balance between, it can't be all COVID all the time, but we also can't ignore this very real problem that is, persistent within society. And I think even though, I think in some countries, I get the impression that for them, it feels like the pandemic is over, although that sort of attitude seems to be dissipating a little bit. But I think that when we look at it overall, this really is something that we have to be dealing with long term, and it is going to be a part of news coverage for a long time, because we don't know when the pandemic will be over, in any kind of, permanent sense. And so I think there is a balance that has to be struck when it comes to news coverage between totally abandoning COVID and, flooding people with COVID coverage. And so, yeah, I think it's also about finding stories that can focus on other things and maybe like slip some COVID through the cracks, and trick people into reading about the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a very good strategy. So there's this other a two-part question. So the first part is, do you think COVID is good for health journalism? And do you think it's too late for somebody to start health journalism now for COVID?
Yes, I think COVID is good for health journalism. I don't want to sound like too flippant about it, because it's obviously a very serious issue, and I think we've all had to deal with it. I think it touches people on a personal level all the time. Where I think that COVID has been beneficial to health reporters as a beat, is that I think for a lot of newsrooms, health was not really, it didn't really feel like a beat that was worth investing in. In fact, a lot of outlets had, disbanded their health desks and gotten rid of them because they were like, it's such a niche beat, like it's not really super important. Nobody really cares about health. And then, when COVID happened, it was like, actually, we need this beat really a lot. And and you had a lot of emphasis put onto health. And I think in South Africa, we were in a bit more of a unique position, because from my perspective, even though I was not technically on the health beat, I was already aware of how present health issues are on other aspects of society. And that's because in South Africa, we have, a very high burden of HIV, and AIDS and TB. So we already have very severe epidemics in our country, and HIV is quite pervasive in a lot of, what we talk about when we're talking about our population, when we're talking about people's experience. You have to have sort of some understanding of how the HIV epidemic is impacting them. And so what I think COVID did was, while we had already been thinking about health in that sense locally in South Africa, I think COVID helped ground that around the world, that health is an essential part of our existence and it is impacting. And I think previously health did feel very isolated. Like it felt like, oh, it's just this one small thing that's happening on the side. Whereas now it's like, actually, no, you can't ignore health issues, because if there is a public health disaster, it actually has very far-reaching consequences. And where I think that's beneficial is I think people are starting to invest more in developing health reporters. And that's not important just for COVID. I think it's important for the future as well, because as depressing as it sounds, even when COVID is over, like there are several other health concerns. Like people are already, thinking about what's going to be the next pandemic or what is the next like thing to look out for. And so I think that in that sense, COVID has helped health reporting in general, because it's strengthening people's skills in this area that can be applicable for a long time into the future. In response to the second part of the question, is it too late to become a COVID reporter? never. It's absolutely like not too late. I think in some sense, it might even be easier to become a COVID reporter now than it was for me to become a COVID reporter, because I really felt like I was just in the dark, sort of like feeling around blindly, trying to like, find my way in the mess of COVID information. Whereas now at least we have like some concretes, and you do have like people with a year of experience behind them. And so I think that it's definitely not too late to come into this beat. And as I said, I think even if you want to jump in on COVID reporting, the benefits to that are not limited to just being a pandemic reporter. Because once you understand COVID and you understand health systems and you understand, the concepts underlying the pandemic, you can transition that into other health reporting in future. So yeah, the short answer to that is you should, if you want to, you should definitely get into COVID reporting.
Okay, so as we're already beyond the 1 hour mark, but there are I'm seeing 3 important questions that I still wanted to take before we call it a day. So the first question here is, what do you think, what are the lessons that other beats that are applicable to other beats from COVID-19 reporting?
Okay. Lessons for other beats. So I think for me, one of
You can take all the time. Okay. Let me give you like 5 seconds.
Another question coming. No, I think that there are actually a lot of lessons for other beats. I think why I was sort of like, because I'm used to it coming the other way around. So I'm like, for me, I use it like the inverse way, where I'm like, when you come from other beats, it's so much easier to translate that into health, as opposed to having to like reverse engineer that and be like, how do you take health reporting and make that applicable to other beats? And I was kind of thinking about it, and I was like, I guess the lesson is the same both ways. Because when you're working on health, you have to get familiar with a lot of things very quickly. And while that is more specific to COVID, that's really my only experience. But so I'm like, in my head, I'm like, health is fast. But I think it comes with a lot of understanding, and it comes with a lot of having to talk to people and get them to explain things to you very easily, which is not really a challenge that I had experienced in other beats, but I think it was a very useful skill because it allowed me to like learn how to talk to a lot of people in different ways and adjust my interview style to the different environments that I was placed in. And I think the sort of logic that I have behind that is that if you're going from health into another beat, the skills that it's giving you to break down concepts, to write technical things in a simple way quickly, to speak to people and understand what they're saying to you and get them to simplify what they're saying to you, all of those are common things that you need to be able to do no matter what beat you're in. And I think the final thing, which I know I've mentioned several times at this point, but I really I feel like it's something that I just really want to emphasize, which is that, health is not an isolated beat. And so for me, while I used it the reverse way, which is that I used my background in covering education and covering politics to shape my health reporting, the inverse is equally true. So if I had only been covering COVID, I would still be able to leave this beat and cover, education. I would still be able to cover politics because I've had to do so much political reporting in relation to COVID. I've had to do, understand how schools are impacted in relation. So I think, it works both ways in this, in that sense, which is that the lessons are applicable either way that you're taking them.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the next question I would like you to take is, I think it's straightforward. BJ, I want to know whether what do you think? Do you think COVID has hijacked the news content related to other critical diseases? I think the answer is obvious, but I also like you to shed a little bit light regarding your response.
um Yes, I think I think the short answer is yes. I think COVID has definitely overpowered a lot of other very serious health issues that are happening. I I do want to say, in some sense, though, I'm not sure how much attention those diseases were getting before COVID. Um, because as I mentioned, health was kind of a dying field in terms of reporting pre-COVID. There was very little investment in health reporting. So I think while there have always been very serious epidemics and public health issues that we need to be paying attention to, they were already kind of sidelined by something bigger before COVID became that something bigger. What I have found is that in some senses, COVID has actually helped highlight some health issues that have been overlooked. So, for instance, when we went into hard lockdown last year, um, there was a lot of concern about the impact that, because so for us, level 5 lockdown is you couldn't leave your house. Like you could basically only go out to get like groceries, like you weren't supposed to do anything. And so there were concerns about what this would mean for people trying to access chronic medication, interruption to HIV services that people were needing. There was concerns about what this would mean for gender-based violence in the country because, some people were trapped at home with their abusers and were unable to, get in touch with the services that could help them. And so I think while, yes, COVID has overtaken health coverage in one sense, it is also helping bring to the forefront other health issues that we should be looking at in relation to COVID. And so that, yeah, that is in the sense of services that are being impacted by the pandemic and sort of helping bring those into the fold rather than seeing it as one or the other. Like, I don't think it should be seen as it's COVID or other diseases. It's all diseases are happening simultaneously and they're all important, and we need to look at health in its entirety.
Yeah, taking this issue of looking at health in its entirety a little bit further, who do you think is to blame for COVID grabbing all the attention? And do you think there is anything that journalists can do to still shed light and bring some attention to other serious health issues?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I can say who's exactly at fault for COVID taking the spotlight. I don't think it's anything intentional. I think it just became inescapable and unavoidable. And I think that's for everybody. It was, whatever you were doing, COVID was something that became important. And so I think from a journalistic standpoint, when something is that pervasive and not just to one small part of, you know, uh, it's not limited to one place, it's something that's affecting everybody globally together. I think it's just natural that it would be pushed to the center like that. I don't think we've really faced an issue in this scale before that's impacted so many people in the same way simultaneously. Um, so I think it was just inevitable that it would reach this point. Um, I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question. How can journalists tackle other health issues? I think that I think that people are ready, and when I say people, I mean like the public, like your audience is ready to engage with health issues. I think people are now primed to absorb health information, and I think people are concerned about their health and where public health is, um, in like as a space, like where we should be looking. For instance, I've noticed, a lot of increasing range of health coverage. So there's been like some talk about fungi, concerns about like fungi being the next pandemic. There's been, increased coverage about anti microbial resistance, in terms of like, overprescription of medication and that kind of thing. And also just looking at other viruses, that we need to be keeping an eye on. And as I said, for South Africa, always HIV is, a very prominent part of what we're looking at, but there's also been an increased interest in, people with underlying health conditions such as diabetes, because that became a concern. Chronic conditions became a concern with COVID. And so I think that in this health beat that has opened up as a result of COVID, there is starting to become a lot more room to address other health issues that are happening in tandem with the pandemic. And I think that the public, is interested in health. And while they may be tired of COVID, that isn't a reason to ignore other health issues that they might be interested in, and looking at, what are health issues that we should be concerned about? What are things we should be paying attention to? Because it is the reality that while COVID is the primary thing that people are looking at, there are very real health issues that are impacting people, on a much smaller scale, that are perhaps being ignored in favor of COVID. But I think that as journalists, if you have the power to shed light on those health issues, then you should definitely use the room, that has been given to you to draw attention to other public health, issues.
So I like to, I think this should be our last question. I'm sorry, I can't get to all the questions. Also, the question is from Abdullah. Health beat is uncommon. If a freelance journalist should decide to start covering health, there is not much media outlet to get published. Are there any recommendation on which media outlets to pitch health-related stories? I think you should start with your answers, then maybe I can also make some comments regarding this.
Yeah, I feel like maybe this one is a bit more challenging for me because I've never really been in the freelance space, and I haven't really had to pitch to a lot of media outlets. I also feel like perhaps it's more specific to your individual media landscape. So for instance, in South Africa, because there are so few health reporters, if you, as a freelancer, you have a health story, there is definitely like room for it to go somewhere. Because, if a media outlet doesn't have a dedicated health reporter, and you have the skill set and the time to do, health coverage for them, there seems to be there's a very receptive environment to accepting pitches and freelancers, in this beat. But I think maybe I'll just hand it over to you, Paul, because maybe you can sort of give more insight generally, to that question.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That was a nice attempt. And on the part of freelance journalists, I think the first thing you need to do as a freelancer is understand which media outlet uses freelancers for their health beats. And there are lots. I disagree with you on the concept that there are not many media outlets accepting health stories, because they are. And because the COVID-19 is a global pandemic, even foreign platforms are interested in getting people on the ground to report local issues. So the first place to start from is to actually identify which media outlets, what do you think is the dream ideal media outlet that you would like to write for? Then you also need to get much closer to these media outlets, know who are the people that are are writing for them, the editors. Like I always recommend, Twitter is a really great place for you to follow editors. You always see call for pitches that they need this story before this time. So identify the news platforms that are actively engaging media, freelancers. Then also identify the editors, follow them on social media, then send them direct messages. But I think the mistake that many freelancers do make is that they are sending the same type of message to 10 different editors that see things differently. They represent media outlets that they are different in the kinds of content that they publish. And so in the course of it, an editor can easily see that this person does not understand our media and why we do things there. So that is what I think is really, really important. You need to take time to do the homework so that you won't spend much time or waste much time in getting your story picked up. I hope that helps. And on that note, I would like to thank everybody that has joined us on today's webinar, especially our extraordinary facilitator today, Aisha from the Bekisisa Center for Health Journalism. And everybody, I hope that you've been able to expand your body of knowledge and gotten new insights on how to expand, how to switch to health journalism. Because like Aisha said, no one knows when this is going to end, and health issues will remain relevant pre-COVID and even beyond COVID. So if you would like to know more about this International Center for Journalists Health Crisis Global Reporting Forum, I encourage you to visit www.icfj.org. And if you would like to access more resources, including how to get started on freelance journalism, where to pitch to, and other important information that are relevant to journalists, I will encourage you to visit IJNet on www.ijnet.org. And if you would like to be part of this amazing ICFJ Global Crisis Reporting Forum, I encourage you to search for the group. Go to Facebook and search for Health Crisis, ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. It's an amazing group that we share insights and tools for everybody. So till next week, when we'll be coming to you again with another exciting webinar in which we'll be discussing another important topic, I say thank you and have a lovely day. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you guys so much, and thank you for having me. And it was a really great session.
Yeah, I really had fun too. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye.